When evaluating the wide receiver position in fantasy football, it's important to remember some key facts about wide receiver production year over year. And we found some of these facts when we were doing some research and when we had our team doing some of this research for us as well. Some of this is really interesting. Top 12 wide receivers, the likelihood that they repeat as a top 12 wide receiver has actually gone up in the last 5 years. Looking at 2019, 2020, it went from like 30% to 40%. In 2023, 2/3 of the wide receiver ones repeated year over year. So that means what? Wide receiver ones have actually become quite safe over the last couple of years, and the consistency of wide receiver ones has become a little bit more profound than it was in years before. So let's look, for example, at last year's wide receiver ones. You've got CeeDee Lamb, you've got Tyreek Hill, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Puka Nacua. All four of those guys are guys that you're pretty confident are going to be wide receiver ones this year. Add in Justin Jefferson, who was hurt last year, wasn't a wide receiver one, but you feel like you're pretty safe with him as well. The fact of the matter is, while there are some safe candidates at wide receiver one, we talked about them, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra, A.J. Brown, those guys, 4 to 5 wide receiver ones every single year. Not only do they not make it back into the top 12 of wide receivers in fantasy football, statistically, they actually don't even make it in the top 24 of total points in fantasy football. I mean, I'm looking at this, the top 12 to top 24 the next year rate in the last 5 years is 60%. You're talking 4 to 5 players on average that are top 12 wide receivers, and the next year they don't even crack the top 24. Now, we are doing this off of total points. Total points is important. You could use points per game. We have the points per game one in front of us. The points per game is a little bit different.
More consistent because it does account for injury. But again, when you're talking about fantasy football, the injuries do count against you, right? They do count against you in the middle of the season. You don't get a pass when one of your guys goes down in the middle of the year. You're like, oh, he just got injured. It's fine, right? Those games that they miss do count against you. So that is why we're going with total points here. And I think it's important to note that those 4 to 5 guys that fall out are generally, you see about half of them that kind of come out of nowhere, that fill that wide receiver one role. And then you have the other half that are people that have produced in the top 24, that have been 13 to 24 previously, and then they make that jump into the top 12 specifically. So when you're looking at the last couple of years, right, there's, again, 13 to 24, you got 12 guys there. And in theory, right, about two of those guys are going to jump up into the top 12. So we're basically trying to figure out which guys are most likely in 2024 to make that wide receiver one jump. The guys that produced as wide receiver twos, which ones are going to make the jump this year? Well, let's look at the past first and let's see if we can find any common denominators. 2022, the guys who made those jumps, Devontae Smith, CeeDee Lamb, and Christian Kirk. They're all wide receiver twos their first year, and they ended up making that jump the following year and being a wide receiver one. 2023, you had Mike Evans and DJ Moore were wide receiver twos, and they made that jump to be wide receiver ones. So when you're looking at each guy's situation, Devonta Smith, he was a rookie. He had a very good underrated rookie season, and he ended up making that wide receiver one jump. CeeDee Lamb had been on the rise for multiple years. We knew that his jump was coming. It was only a matter of time. He finally cracked the top 12 wide receivers, and he was an alpha there. He was the guy. They drafted him to be the guy. We knew that was going to happen. Yep. Christian Kirk, probably the most unexpected guy. I remember you were a lot higher on Christian Kirk than a lot of people were. Everybody laughed at the Jags for signing Christian Kirk and overpaying him.
Good signing.
And it ended up being a pretty good signing, and he ended up being a wide receiver one, being a slot exclusive wide receiver. It was like 95% of his snaps that year were in the slot. So a lot of his production came from just the consistency of targets, a very Michael Pittman-esque. Mm-hmm. And then 2023, you have Mike Evans, who I guess the reason is it's Mike Evans. He had another year where he had a ton of touchdowns. The year before, he kind of had a down year with touchdowns, and he got, his normal 1,000+ receiving yards. Yeah. It's just classic Mike Evans. Yeah. DJ Moore got a lot of opportunity, more opportunity than we expected in an offense where Justin Fields was throwing the ball, and we were low on DJ Moore because of it. He was able to transcend because he got like over 30% of the targets there and played a decent amount of slot as well because Justin Fields was very limited as a passer. Yep. So I think when you're looking at those situations, you have a couple guys that are young and developing, and then you have some who you see two guys get a lot more slot usage with more targets, and then you have Mike Evans. Okay, Mike Evans.
Mike
Great.
Evans. Right. He's a veteran that had more touchdowns, and touchdowns are volatile, and it jumped up. Okay, so let's look at the wide receiver 2s last year and figure out, okay, who are the candidates this year to jump up? Michael Pittman, playing with a different quarterback this year, but still probably not a guy I would consider a big jump up candidate. I think Michael Pittman's most likely range of outcomes is to remain in wide receiver 2s. And when you're looking at that data, the wide receiver 2s that stay in the top 24 every year, that is only over a 5-year average 50%. So on average, you have about half of the guys that are wide receiver 2s the year before that are not wide receiver 2s the year after. Okay, so it is also, you'll have to consider the amount of turnover here is crazy. You have 4 to 5 guys that are wide receiver 1s out of the top 24, and then you've got 6 guys in the top, on the 13 to 24 range that are out of the top 24 as well. So that means what? You have at least half, if not more, every year of the top 24 wide receivers cycling in and out.
Yep.
So, and we know the
it's even
guys.
worse once you look at wide receiver 3s. Like, it's not even worth looking at 25 to 36 because it's that bad and it's that inconsistent.
So the guys, let's first talk about the guys we think could make the jump this year. Brandon Ayuk. Brandon Ayuk, he's been pretty consistently the high-end wide receiver 2 range. I think Deebo Samuel's an example of a veteran like Mike Evans who could end up jumping up there because he gets a lot of touchdowns this year or something like that. Devonta Smith, probably not. Chris Olave, probably not. Adam Thielen is one of those guys I would expect regression from this year. Amari Cooper is a guy that I think he's kind of Mike Evans-ish as well, a veteran, but I'm probably not my first bet. Calvin Ridley is a guy that I think he's our dark horse to jump up into the wide receiver 1 range this year. Yep. And a lot of people don't like the Calvin Ridley pick in fantasy football right now. I don't know what there is not to like. DeAndre Hopkins was good last year. I mean, DeAndre Hopkins was wide receiver 22 in total points. So obviously he was decent enough, even as old as he is and as limited as he has become compared to what he used to be. He's still a great receiver, but compared to what he used to be, he's not the same D-Hop. He did that last year, though, in a Titans offense that was significantly worse than the one you're going to see rolled out this year. And so that should be noted. A lot of people want to short Calvin Ridley because, A, it's the Titans, which is a new Titans team with Brian Callahan. Brian Callahan has been very vocal about how they're going to use Calvin Ridley, basically saying like they're going to use him in the Jamar Chase role in that offense. He said that word for word. And look, does it mean he's going to produce like Jamar Chase? No. Does it mean he's as good as Jamar Chase? No. Does it mean hardly anything? Not hardly anything, but it does mean a little bit. It does mean that they view Calvin Ridley from a team investment standpoint and from a weapon standpoint as the best wide receiver on their team. They paid him like the best wide receiver on their team. He is the wide receiver 1 in Tennessee. So Calvin Ridley is a guy we think could jump up this year. Who else in the wide receiver 2 range do you think could jump up into the wide receiver 1 range this year?
I think Amari Cooper is a guy that you'd want to look at, but there are at least a couple question marks with him regarding, let's be honest, Jerry Jeudy getting that kind of Christian Kirk-esque signing this offseason where you're like, where did that come from? Did he really deserve that? Has he ever shown that he can ever be a dominant wide receiver? Not necessarily, but maybe Cleveland knows something that we don't. So, and Amari Cooper is on the wrong side of 30 now. So right. I think there's a good chance for him just because of the opportunity he got last year and in a offense that was all over the place at the quarterback position. You would expect to be a little more consistent this year there.
Sure.
So he could be a candidate. I still think Michael Pittman could be a candidate as well because he was so not touchdown dependent last season.
True.
He had more targets than he ever had in his career, and I expect his target volume to stay about the same in an offense that's going to be very Michael Pittman friendly with Anthony Richardson, as much as that's against popular opinion. I'm looking at these guys. Devonta Smith, increased targets. CeeDee Lamb, increased targets. Christian Kirk, increased targets. DJ Moore, increased targets. Every single one of those guys had an opportunity to increase their target volume, and that's how they made the wide receiver 1 jump. And I think that's why we're such a fan of Calvin Ridley, because he doesn't have a Christian Kirk that he's competing with. He doesn't have an Evan Ingram, who led the Jags in targets last year as a tight end. He's literally a wide receiver labeled as a tight end.
Right.
Like, this is... I don't understand why we do not like this situation when he's going to get the same amount, if not more targets than Chris Olave in a just as bad, if not, in my opinion, worse offense in New Orleans. Like, this is kind of our point here.
It's not even close. The Colts offense is miles better than the Saints offense.
No, the Titans.
Oh, okay.
Because I was
Sorry.
talking about Ridley.
I thought you were talking about Pittman.
Look, this is the discussion that I had with someone who asked me the question, like, why do you prefer Calvin Ridley over Chris Olave? In a vacuum, I prefer Chris Olave over Calvin Ridley.
Oh.
I'm not that crazy. It's all about the price in fantasy football and the investment. And what we're showing you here is outside of those safe 7, we could call them the safe 7, right, that are wide receiver 1s, it really is a crapshoot for who's going to make that jump into the top 12 producing wide receivers. And when you're looking at the historical data here, Calvin Ridley really does have just as good a chance to make that wide receiver jump as Chris Olave does.
He definitely does.
He absolutely does, and he's going multiple rounds later. I understand that we love Chris Olave. Like, I like Chris Olave, the talent. I Chris Olave him.
You Chris Olave him.
And he's... I think long-term, he has a really good chance to, eventually make that DJ Moore jump. You know what I'm saying, with potentially a better quarterback in the future, but it's not changing this year. It's not. George Pickens is a guy that a lot of people are expecting to make a massive jump. Again, when you're looking at the historical data, George Pickens has just as good a chance as any of these other guys to make that jump. And why would I bet on that offensive situation? Why would I bet on Russell Wilson and or Justin Fields being able to help George Pickens be this alpha wide receiver in the making?
Right.
To me, I would rather go with the guy who's already shown that he can command 140 targets in an offense with Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram.
So let's look at some guys that were wide receiver ones last year, because again, on average, the data supports the idea that 4 to 5 wide receiver ones every year aren't even in the top 24 total points wide receivers the next year. So the guys that we think could be those guys this year, Keenan Allen is one of them. And Keenan Allen is being priced accordingly. He's being priced as the wide receiver 33. Between the age and between the increase in target competition for Keenan Allen in a new situation, I think everybody's kind of expecting that he could and will be a guy that kind of moves out of the top 24. I don't think it's out of the range of outcomes that he is a top 24 wide receiver. In fact, I put it at a 35-40% chance he is a top 24 wide receiver. It's Keenan Allen.
33% chance.
And he looked good.
Give the other 33 to Odunze and DJ Moore.
Right, exactly. But, again, most people are pricing that in. Mike Evans is a guy that people are predicting at the moment with his ADP that he will not be a top 12 wide receiver, so you'll see that turnover, but will remain a top 24 wide receiver. DJ Moore, remaining a top 24 wide receiver at wide receiver 22. Diggs, wide receiver 23. Devontae Adams, wide receiver 14. Nico Collins, wide receiver 12. And so the problem is...
I'd even put Ayuk in there as a potential regression candidate as well, outside of the top 12.
Here's the problem. The problem is, right now, we're projecting that 75% of the players who were top 24 wide receiver 2s last year, or wide receiver 2 or higher last year, will remain in that range. And realistically, there's about a 50% turnover rate every year. I mean, let's just look. Top 24 wide receivers year over year that stayed in the top 24. I mean, the 13 through 24, again, is at 50%. The top 12 is at 60%. So again, you're talking a little bit less, or about half of those receivers that won't repeat, and we're pricing most of these guys like they will. So with that, I mean, again, Diggs is 23, Devontae Adams is 14, Nico is 12. I think that you should expect at least 2 or 3 of those guys to move out of the top 24 this year. A lot of times it's due to injury. So we're not going to sit here and act like we can predict injury either. But at the same time, you should know that there's so much variance that sometimes drafting the guys that are, priced as wide receiver 3s in fantasy football is just as safe as drafting a guy priced as a wide receiver 2 3 rounds earlier, just like Nathan said. Yep. And so to wrap it up, let's look at a couple guys in that range that we think, not only could do it, but have just as good a chance as anybody to be top 24 wide receivers. Tank Dell, easy. Touchdowns, that one could easily happen. Zay Flowers, that's one we're betting on. We're betting that he's going to make that jump. George Pickens, like you mentioned, he's absolutely a candidate for this. Unlikely, probably, but still a candidate for sure. T. Higgins didn't play last year. He could easily do this, right? Christian Kirk wasn't on this list last year. You saw
he was the year before.
The year before, he's top 12.
Without Calvin Ridley.
Right? Hollywood Brown, I would argue that Hollywood Brown has a decent chance as well.
Yep.
Depending on how he ends up with Patrick Mahomes and depending on how that offense is. Chris Godwin, that's a really good one that we've been talking about. I think Chris Godwin playing back in his natural position in the slot, you're going to see an increase in targets, right? And so you talk about that increase in targets rate. Chris Godwin could be a guy that jumps up into the top 24. The point is...
Jaden Reed.
Deontay Johnson.
Yep.
Jackson Smith and Jigba. The point is the turnover at wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 both is higher than you think every year. And so again, this goes back to we talk about what?
But also don't undervalue the safety of those top 7.
No, and I don't think people are. I mean, I think with Jefferson, Lamb, Hill, Chase, Amon-Ra, AJ Brown, and Puka Nacua.
I mean, that's
your top 7.
Yeah, but that is a big deal to note, though. Like, just make sure you know that when you're in the first round and you're faced with, do I take this wide receiver? Do I take this top 7 wide receiver, or do I take
a running back?
A running back.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You just need to know what you're sacrificing when you're taking one of those running backs in the first round. You're going for upside, which is absolutely understandable, and at times I may even be in support of it. I may be leaning that way, but not in every single one of my fantasy drafts. I am going for that safety with one of those top 7 wide receivers for sure.
And I think the running back data here is also relevant. So we'll follow up. We'll do a video. Our next video will be with this running back data, and we'll tell you the other side of this coin. So this is part 1. But again, some jump up candidates, some guys we think are probably going to regress, and then the safe guys. And then we'll talk about the running back data is pretty much the inverse of this, and it's going to change how you draft in fantasy football. So keep a lookout for that video. But our 2024 draft guide is out. All you have to do to get it is go to flockfantasy.com/domain. 1, use code domain. 2, sign up for any Mother Flocker subscription. 3, then you unlock the draft guide. Okay, you have to use code domain, but you get our draft guide, you get our league projections tool, you get our fantasy football rankings, plus you get a lot more. Like I said, flockfantasy.com/domain. Use code domain. Make sure you guys like this video and subscribe if you play fantasy football and if you enjoyed the research here. Appreciate you guys joining us, and we'll see you later.